Welcome back. This is our fourth and final module, and we're going to see it covers from a 2001 election of Campbell here and the Liberals to our present day. And we'll see a host of things are going to happen, many of them unanticipated, that are certainly going to affect resources and our use of resources, and in fact, that's going to affect the landscape of British Columbia, as we'll see. As you can see in the slide, that no sooner is Campbell elected, and then of course what we have is the whole 911 terrorism issue, and oh boy, does that have an impact on the movement of goods and services and people between borders, and it's still with us in many ways today, and the lineups and not being able to go across the borders. So certainly unanticipated. It elevated, of course, terrorism to a new level globally, is really what happened here, and has a huge impact on resource use, and it certainly affected our economy. Of course, that transitioned into a couple of wars, one in Afghanistan and the other one in Iraq. And while we were involved, at least in the Iraq War, that what it impacts also is things like the price of oil rise. And so say that these are unanticipated events, but it has an impact on resources. Another little box I put down there is a referendum on Aboriginal title. We saw in the last module that that the election of an NDP government was the first one in '91 to recognize Aboriginal title and modern-day treaties for British Columbia, and of course we got the Nisga'a Treaty out of that. Campbell and the Liberals were never happy with that. In fact, when the Nisga'a Treaty was signed, they took it to court and said that it wasn't constitutional. At any rate, what Campbell, once he gets elected, realizes that he thought that the issue would be resolved not by recognizing Aboriginal title, but going to a referendum, and he did. And there were a number of questions. Most people in British Columbia didn't participate. Of course, those who did participate really, of course, endorsed what Campbell wanted, which is that that Aboriginal title should be more like a municipality in British Columbia, in other words, under the provincial government. So that denial of Aboriginal title, continued. Of course, as we saw earlier with the Delgamuukw case and so on, it really, he doesn't have a choice because the courts have recognized that unceded Crown lands really are part of First Nations territories, and they must be consulted and compensated. There are other issues he ran into. He lifted the fish farm moratorium. We mentioned before that there's concerns about wild salmon versus farm salmon, and one contaminating the other, and so the NDP had put a moratorium on it. Campbell lifted that moratorium, saying we need more fish farms and more jobs and so on. This is this map here is the Broughton Archipelago, which is the north end of Vancouver Island, and you can see all those red lines with arrows on them, and that's the migration path of pink salmon. Pink salmon are on a 2-year cycle. In other words, that they're born in the freshwater streams and lakes, and then migrate out to the ocean and return in 2 years to spawn and die. And so you can see also all those black squares. Those black squares are fish farms for salmon. And by the way, most of the salmon are actually Atlantic salmon, not our Pacific species of salmon. So there are different species, potentially different diseases and so on, but they're also the breeding grounds of sea lice, and you can see some of the sea lice on those baby salmon. So there's an expectation, of course, in 2 years of how many salmon will return, and of course the expectation is that there'd be over 3.5 million pink salmon returning, In fact, 147,000 returned. So it was a major collapse of the pink salmon run. And again, it's the fish farms that were blamed by the commercial fishing industry. And so again, these are issues about resource management and should these fish farms be allowed there in these spawning channels. Now, the other thing that happened early on in Campbell's term was, of course, the Olympic bid, the Winter Olympics, and we won in 2003. And so, again, similar to what we saw with Expo 86, this means more infrastructure. In other words, more resources, more jobs, and more building. And of course, all the venues for an Winter Olympics with the Oval out there in Richmond, and of course a major infrastructure project was the Canada Line, and of course improvement to the Sea to Sky Highway up to Whistler. So that certainly produced more construction jobs and more employment overall. Overlapping a lot of this, and certainly starting back in the 1990s, was more awareness of climate change and scientists trying to put out the warning signals that, hey, we're using too many carbon-related fuels such as oil and gas and coal, and that we should begin to curb this because it's going to get us into a lot of trouble. And so Al Gore's book, An Inconvenient Truth, and film came out in 2006 to really try and highlight some of the problems. And of course, like Hurricane Katrina, which many of you are aware of, like a major disaster. And of course, what the scientists were saying is that, through climate change, is not only are we going to get more hurricanes, but they're going to be of greater magnitude. And of course, that's exactly what's happening, along with wildfires and on and on. And so Campbell is really aware of all of this. And interestingly enough, he's and British Columbia becomes the first province to introduce a carbon tax. And of course, a carbon tax is actually to curb the amount of carbon and increase your price of gas so that you drive less and so forth. Of course, there's a reaction to that, but actually it turns out it was a very successful tax and then really didn't hurt the economy at all. So here's the Liberals leading the way in terms of going in the right direction in terms of climate change. And the federal government, well, the federal government has some contradictions. They certainly sign on to the Copenhagen Accord, as you can see up there, which endorses the Kyoto Protocol, which was earlier. All of this, of course, is to cut our carbon emissions. But meantime, we see as conservative governments at that time, federally, and look what they start promoting, the Northern Gateway Pipeline. So we're going to pipeline oil right through to Kitimat and across to Asia. That we want more oil to get back to Eastern Canada, and so the Trans-Canada Pipeline. And then we find out there's another pipeline, the Kinder Morgan Pipeline, to get oil down here to Burnaby and to Burrard Inlet. So what you have is a federal government that, in one hand, is saying yes, we're going to sign the Copenhagen Accord, and yes, we're going to curb our carbon emissions. But by 2011, we are so far behind in our targets that we just pull out of Kyoto. So in other words, we recalibrate the timelines. It doesn't suit the federal government, and so it is no wonder that people become a little cynical. Now, again, we have unforeseen outside influences, and for some of you would remember that the subprime lending rates in the U.S. brought down the economy, including the one in Canada. It was a situation that was just absolutely absurd, that you didn't have to have a job. You could owe money, but if you wanted to buy a house, yeah, we're going to lend you money for it. And so, of course, the lure being that that land prices and housing prices never collapse. Well, they did. And if you are really interested in a very good movie that shows all that, is the film called The Big Short. And so you can put that on your viewing list. It's well worthwhile. But it resulted in a recession because, of course, that essentially the commodity market collapsed, including oil. Um, and people aren't going to be building houses, and so our wood products and so on are going to be curtailed. We know that GM and Chrysler both went bankrupt, and the government had to bail them out. So this is a serious issue in terms of employment, and a serious issue in terms of, and it shows the vulnerability of relying on a resource economy. And you'll remember this too, that the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, catastrophic, and thousands of people lost their lives. Again, one doesn't have that expectation, although I think in British Columbia we should be aware that we are uh, uh, on a similar trajectory at some point of having a major earthquake and tsunami. But you can see what I put here: destroyed the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and tragically, it's still spewing out emissions into the water and the air as we speak. What Japan did is they shut down all 50 of their nuclear power plants when this happened, because they wanted to make sure that they were going to be safe. And I must say that South Korea did the same thing. Now, when you shut down 50 nuclear power plants, that's 1/3 of your electrical energy. And so you need to ask that question, like, where is that energy going to come from? Because you're not going to turn your lights off for 1/3 of the day. Um, and the answer was, of course, liquefied natural gas. And that's what they turned to, is liquefied natural gas. And we'll have a lot more to say about that. Well, meanwhile, we have a new Liberal leader, Christy Clark, and we have an election coming up in 2013, and now it's almost as if Christy Clark had caused the tsunami. Don't write that in your notes, though. Um, and of course, the big political push is that we are going to build LNG plants in British Columbia, 15 or 20 of them even, and we are going to export that LNG to Japan and to Asia generally. And it's going to bring in billions of dollars of outside investment, and it's going to be thousands of jobs. In fact, we're going to have so much money, we'll probably take off the sales tax in British Columbia. So, and I guess what's worse is that that she's saying that that this LNG, which is natural gas turned into liquefied natural gas, is a green energy because it's probably going to replace coal, and then we know that this is cleaner than coal, so it's a green energy, as if it doesn't mean producing carbon. But she also put a freeze on the carbon tax. In other words, she wasn't going to have more taxes on gasoline and oil. So again, a number of contradictions, as well as amnesia in a way, but we'll have more to say about that. By 2014, we need to ask that question: is LNG a green energy source? And so let's expose what LNG is all about. First of all, most of our natural gas now is produced from fracking, and so it's also called unconventional natural gas. And so you have a picture here of the fracking process, and what fracking does is that you drill down and you drill into these shale gas deposits under the surface of the earth. And the new fracking technology is that from one drill you can go into those formations, and you can go in any number of directions. So in other words, you can have a whole series of drills from one central drill going down. And what you do is you pump water down and a series of chemicals, and you fracture the shale gas. And in fracturing it, it means, of course, it releases more natural gas. And so now you retrieve the water that you've pumped down, but carrying with it will be now natural gas. And so you have a huge amount of contaminated water because it's got all these chemicals in it. And then you scrub the natural gas to make it clean natural gas. And now you want to take the natural gas and you're going to turn it into liquefied natural gas. And to do that, you've got to turn that natural gas down to minus 162 degrees Celsius. In other words, it's bloody cold. And it takes an enormous amount of energy to be able to get it down to that temperature. And of course, you can use natural gas to get it down there, but all of this means that you're going to increase the number of greenhouse gases you use. And then, of course, I've also said that, well, of course, you could use Site C, and that's the new hydroelectric dam we are building on the Peace River. And so if you use that, of course, you don't have as many greenhouse gases released. And so what you're really doing is you're taking natural gas, and by reducing it to that temperature, you're increasing the volume by 600 times. In other words, natural gas is what you might call a terrestrial energy source. In other words, we can pipeline it, and we have all over British Columbia and over much of Canada. But to use it internationally, in other words, to ship it, you've got to turn it 600 times into into liquefied natural gas, so that you can put it on those liquefied natural gas tankers, and then you can ship it internationally. But the shipping causes more greenhouse gases, and of course eventually it's going to be burned to produce electricity, and it doesn't really matter whether it's in Japan or China or here. It's going to produce greenhouse gases. So it's a bit of a sham to call it a green energy source. That wasn't the only thing that we need to expose, but what happened in 2014 is that we also had the Mount Polley disaster. That's a big open pit mine up there in the Chilcotin, and the tailing pond burst, and of course all the contaminated water flowed into the river system, and it's a river system that is a branch of the Fraser River system. So this is a salmon-bearing river. So again, it shows that mining's risky. It's a huge risk for what the jobs you get. And so that's that balance again between resource management about those jobs versus the environment. And another interesting thing that surfaced by 2014 is this notion of U.S. coal exports from Surrey. What happened in the United States? First of all, I should say that the United States is the largest producer of natural gas in the world now, and it's through fracking. They have huge amounts of fracking, not only for natural gas, but also for oil. And so that means that all the coal, and they have a lot of coal-fired electrical plants in the United States, they started switching to natural gas. It means less greenhouse gases for sure. And now what are they going to do with this, coal that's high carbon producing coal? Well, they're going to send it to Asia, except that California said, well, you can't ship it through our ports. It's too dirty. And Oregon and Washington State said the same thing. Can't do it through ours. So where do they send it? They send it up here, right past White Rock and to the Surrey docks there, and we ship it to Asia, U.S. coal. So again, I'm not so sure about that, and we'll have more to say after a few more slides. But something else that we were talking about is about First Nations and the Chilcotin, who have been pursuing their own struggle for getting their land back, got it back. And they went through not the treaty process, which is pretty arduous and long and involved and costly, but went through the Supreme Court, and they got their land back. It's subject to in the national interest, which means that if the federal or provincial government feels it's so important to have something go through there, that they can do that. But otherwise, the Chilcotin First Nations essentially have control over that land and resources up there in the Chilcotin. The climate change equation that does not add up. So here's some of the things happening here in Canada and British Columbia. So on the one hand, we've got climate change science, and so there are very, very few scientists who are opposed or ignore the perils of climate change, and it's directly related to too much carbon, so from fossil fuels. Now, the public perception, I think, is pretty much on side. I think people are aware of climate change and are aware of some of the catastrophes that happened, and I think that the public was happy that Trudeau signed on to the Paris Agreement to cut our greenhouse gases. Although you can see I've said that we're already falling behind. But then there's political policies, and virtually all the political parties stress the importance of resources. They are so important to our economy. There are huge subsidies to the petrochemical industry, to oil and gas, coal, that these same governments promote oil and gas pipelines and production of more hydrocarbons. And then the other side of their mouth, they're saying, oh, we've got to improve and reduce our carbon footprint in the future. And of course, that's the key. It's always in the future, not now. And so that the final question I put down there is that are resources, the good producing section, that important to our economy? In other words, are those politicians right about sort of like stressing how important these resources are? Or is there something else happening? So this is reality in terms where people live and work in British Columbia now. And there's a link between where people live and where people work. And so I started by putting on that table there of employment in British Columbia between the goods producing sector, and we'll defined it there, and we'll talk about that. But you can see back in 1951 that over 53% of the population was in the goods producing sector. And that makes sense. I think we saw how we started out that second module where, the W.A.C. Bennett era of producing all of that forestry and mining and oil and gas and pipelines and hydroelectric dams and those were the drivers of the economy. But look, by 2019, right? It's only 19% of the employment. So we've shifted away from that. And so let's look at how the goods sector is broken down for 2019. So agriculture makes up 1% of the employment. And of course, we talked a little bit about that in terms of that one of the things that helped agriculture, of course, was related to the wine industry and tourism. But forestry, fishing, mining, quarrying, oil and gas, all lumped together, only amount to 2.5% of the employment in this province. Now, utilities, which of course can be energy, in other words, hydroelectric plants and so on, or they can be municipal water and sewage, which is of course much more urban and not directly related to fishing, forestry, or any of those kinds of things. Mind you, it's only 1% of employment. Construction is the big one. And of course, construction can be on pipelines or dams like Site C, or they can be urban construction and infrastructure. In other words, take a look around cities and look at those cranes and the number of jobs related to building more high-rises and condos and houses generally, or extending a SkyTrain or building another bridge or road system. So that's 9.2. Well, that's essentially half of the goods producing sector. And then there's manufacturing, and that includes those people who work in sawmills and pulp and paper mills. But it can also be for food or textiles or electronic equipment. And so these are not necessarily directly related to our resources, and that's fairly significant. It's 6.5% of that 19%. So that's the goods producing sector, and that's how Census Canada breaks it down, and where those numbers come from. But I started out by saying is that where people live and where they work are related, and this table at the bottom here, again, you can see that in 1951, nearly half the population is rural. That makes sense because 53.1% of the jobs are in the good producing sector. People farmed and fished and they worked in at sawmills and logging and in mines, and these are all rural places. But look what's happened by 2017. Like over 86% of the population's urban. And so that link is really like, it's not the goods producing sector where that's happening, that those people are much more related to the service employment, which is the 81%. And so we have transitioned from essentially 50% urban to now over 86% urban. But we'll see in this next slide that it's very interesting breakdown. So the uneven distribution of population. So now when we look at the overall province and you break it down into its 7 economic regions, that you'll see that the bottom 4, the Kootenay, Caribou, the Skeena, and the Peace River region, that's the hash marks I put on there, that is over 3/4 of the province geographically, but less than 10% of the population. So we have a very, very uneven distribution of population. And the other thing that's interesting is that when you look at the population of our 10 largest cities in the province, over 80% of the population live in just those 10 cities. So again, it's like we're getting more and more urban. As we get more and more urban, we're doing more and more services. And you can see how like Vancouver, which dominates everything, Victoria, Kelowna, and Abbotsford Mission are called CMAs. That's Census Metropolitan Areas. So in the last census 2011, that to become a census metropolitan area, you had to have over 100,000 population, and that's how you get labeled that. Well, those next ones on the list, Nanaimo, Kamloops, and Chilliwack, were not over 100,000 back in 2011. But the next census, 2021, that I suspect we'll see that Nanaimo, Kamloops, and Chilliwack will all be added as census metropolitan areas. So we'll increase our number of our census metropolitan areas. But what's interesting about being labeled a census metropolitan area is that the census also breaks down the distribution of employment between goods and services for census metropolitan areas. So here we talked about how that the whole overall province, that it's only 19% of the employment is in the goods producing sector. In these 4 census metropolitan areas, it represents 73% of that 19%. In other words, almost 3/4 of the goods producing sector is just in 4 cities. In other words, that it's really mostly about construction, a bit of utilities, and manufacturing. And these are not directly related to our forests or our mining or oil and gas. And so what this is stressing is that unlike what the politicians are saying is how important resources are for our economy, they really aren't. And then the politicians say, but that brings in so much of our revenue. Well, it does bring in some revenue, and you can see it's over $3 billion there for the 2018-2019. And this comes out of the Financial and Economic Review of British Columbia. And it's important. You can see it's 5.4%. But here, put in, the sale and transfer of property brings in more revenues. And that's why it's so huge in British Columbia, is about property and sales and real estate. It's more than natural resource revenues, and so it's trying to put that in some perspective. Now, as we get closer here to the end, let me try and make a few points here. Exposing the myth is not to diminish the importance of resource employment. So the myth being like resources are so important to the economy. So exposing that myth is not to try and say, resource employment isn't important. All jobs are important. But now I think we've reached the point where we have to say some resources are harming our economy and are harming us globally. And so do we put more and more emphasis on those petrochemical industries and fuels that produce greenhouse gases? So in other words, does the fossil fuel industry trump climate change and all the things that the scientists are saying about the evils of climate change, and yet we still promote more and more fossil fuels. Another thing I put in there is that at what point do we see fossil fuel extraction and use similar to asbestos mining? We used to mine asbestos. We had Cassiar asbestos in northeast British Columbia, but at some point we realized asbestos is carcinogenic, and the people who mine it, it's a huge risk, and cancers and so on, and most people would shake their head and say, mine asbestos, give your head a shake. And so at what point do we say that with fossil fuels? Because we're certainly harming the environment. And you can see that the federal government and provincial government are subsidizing the fossil fuel industry unbelievably. And my final caption was that if we're going to subsidize energy, let's turn to the renewable energy sector. Let's turn to wind farms and solar, and we're doing a bit of that. But we've got to do way more and turn on to the electric cars and those kinds of things, and turn away from oil and gas. And that's not something I'm suggesting overnight. That we phase this out is really what we have to do. And of course, we now have been hit by the pandemic, as we all know. But it's got a few lessons for us. And one of the things is that it certainly is, at least in the short run, it cut down on greenhouse gases pretty quickly, and that's because, as you can see on the freeway there, nobody driving, no planes, and international flights have been curbed still, and many people working from home, and it's changed where we work and where we live considerably, and perhaps for a longer term than whenever quote is normal. One of the lessons I put on here is that when the pandemic happened, and people were concerned as they saw this could affect them individually, that we listened for the most part to science, and the science was saying flatten the curve, and and we did. We're relaxing things a little bit, and it's coming back. Nevertheless, we were listening to science, and of course, the same should happen in terms of climate change. In other words, that we've got to reduce our carbon footprint. We've got to flatten that curve too, in terms of our use of carbon-producing fuels. Another thing that came out of the World Health Organization is the number of people who die from air pollution. You can see on there that it's like, 7 million deaths in 2019. And a lot of that was due to climate change. And so again, the question should be, well, maybe we should look at that as a kind of pandemic, and again listen to science and flatten that curve as well. Oh, we're going the wrong way here. Here's our last one. And it's really the last slide and a kind of summary. And really it's how we've transitioned from a resource to a service economy, is what this lesson has been in terms of looking at resources. And you can see that we've had just a huge number of unanticipated events, and more will happen in the future, of course. And some of those unanticipated events, such as the natural hazards we call from climate change, we can reduce those if we go in the right direction. Again, we saw that changes in technologies, and whether those are technologies of open pit mining or the satellite communication and globalization, that had a tremendous impact on resource use. And of course, there's all the political policies that we can deny climate change as politicians, and we know some south of the border are doing that. We don't have to subsidize, hydrocarbons, and so political policies are critical in terms of our directions that we go in. And of course, there's always inevitable depletion of both renewable and non-renewable resources, and literally in British Columbia we've overcut the forests, and we don't have as much wood as we used to, and of course things like copper and mines do run out eventually, and we know that technology can change some of that stuff. And also we have to pay attention to things like our societal values, that as we recognize Indigenous title and modern day treaties, we're going to see a shift that's happening here, and as people become more aware of the environment, that these are important things to go, and all of these are often related, and of course it means that if we rely on resources, those good producing sector resources, that world market prices, it makes them very fragile, and as I say, we have changed in British Columbia. So what's happened is that, to go back to our first module, we had old Harold Innes there talking about Staples theory, and we've shifted a long way from that, and it's not so much that it's those tangible resources that are so important to our economy. It's human resources. That's what's happened, and that's where our economy is going. That's where our economy is, and it's going to go that way more in the future. So I'd like to finish by thanking Katrina for allowing me to talk to you people. I hope that that the next sector of your textbook, you will enjoy that. There's some very, very interesting stories there, and how resources have really modified and structured, you might say, our landscape here in British Columbia. So good luck with reading that. Thank you.